Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my updated tier list with Mega Evolutions releasing. Mega Evolutions has changed actually quite a bit in the format, and I'm going to be going over exactly where I think these are. At the recording of this video, the Milwaukee Regional Championships are coming up in this next week, so I've been actively preparing for that tournament, and I feel like I have a pretty good idea of where the metagame is sitting. So, with that being said, let's hop right into it. Starting off here, let's start off with a deck that's been getting quite a lot of talk recently, and that is going to be Ledge. Ledge, in my opinion, actually has a lot of potential in this format. I think of this deck as actually a tier 1 deck currently. I think it has a chance against a lot of the top matchups. You're pretty decent into Gardevoir paired up with the Jellicent. Yes, things like the Mew EX can be scary as they can copy Ledge's second attack, which actually deals 280. However, if you are able to find that legacy energy, definitely make it pretty difficult for them as they'd only be able to take one prize card. Your Dragapult matchup is relatively fine, as well as some of your other matchups. Like your Grimstar matchup is close. You have a really solid matchup in two decks like the Golden Go. So I think this deck actually has a lot of potential right now. You're able to hit huge amounts of damage, also to knock out those 3 prize Mega Evolutions as well. So I think this deck has a lot going for it, and I personally think it is a tier 1 deck based off my testing. Next up here, we have Golden Ghost Solrock. I personally think Golden Ghost Solrock is a tier 2 deck. I've done the testing with the deck. I think it's really powerful. However, it does take some really difficult matchups into some of the top decks. For example, your matchup into Ledge is just not very good. Your Gardevoir matchup is actually extremely close. I think that the Jellicent variant has a very good shot at beating it. And you are a deck that has a very linear matchup spread. You're very good against a lot of the, I would say, top 3 to 4 decks in the format. However, when you play against a lot of, some of the other, tier 2, tier 2.5, tier 3 decks, sometimes your matchup spread's linearity gets exposed, where you're not necessarily a deck that has a whole lot of wiggle room against a lot of the rogue archetypes, whereas decks like, for example, Gardevoir and Dragapult have a much better, time against some of those, I would say, weaker or more niche decks in the format. I personally think that Ledge is actually a little bit better than Golden Go at the moment, simply because having access to Legacy Energy and also Briar give yourself a lot of versatility against, some of those tricky one prize decks and just, things that can, I guess, be kind of unexpected. So at the moment, I think, Golden Go as an archetype is, very, I would say, solid. It has a very consistent engine and you kind of know what to expect from it. However, I kind of like the Togekiss variant right now, simply because you have a little bit more versatility against some of those more niche matchups. Next up, we got some of the Gardevoir variants. I would personally not really recommend the Mega Gardevoir variant. However, I do think it is just a tier 2 deck. I pretty much think any Gardevoir variant is a tier 2 deck or maybe tier 3. I'm honestly don't even really know if I want to include this because this is under the assumption that it's more of a Mega Gardevoir deck, which if it's just more of a Mega Gardevoir deck, I wouldn't recommend playing this variant. I personally am under the impression the pure Gardevoir, that just really focuses on consistency, or the Jellicent are the best ways to play it. So we're just going to put this down into the fun tier at the moment, and we're going to go over both of the Gardevoir variants that I expect to see the majority of play. So we have Gardevoir Jellicent. I think this is definitely one of the strongest decks in the format. Had a great tournament run at the most recent Pittsburgh Regional Championships, and just is, a very, very strong deck. You have a chance against a lot of different matchups. However, you do have some pretty rough matchups. For example, your Zoroark matchup is definitely very, very scary. You don't have, things, like heavy Bravery Charm as well, so you can sometimes struggle against the Terror Box matchup a little bit more. So I think the deck, though, is really good overall. Its Ledge matchup is very scary too, but I just think, Gardevoir in general is just a tier 1 deck. I think definitely makes a great play for this tournament. I also think that just, regular Gardevoir as well, in my opinion, deserves a tier 1 spot. I think that regular Gardevoir is, yes, weaker into Jellicent. However, you are stronger, into decks like the Ledge and the Golden Go, as you could play things like, maybe Fluttermane TM Devo or something like the Drifloon Bravery Charm. The problem is that if you don't have any, I would say, techs for the Jellicent, this variant has a very difficult time against this, but in my opinion is probably a little bit better against the rest of the field. Next up here, we have, let's go over some of the new decks. I think Venusaur is a tier 3 deck at the moment. If it gets going, it has a lot of potential. The problem is does it actually get going? That's, kind of the thing that it struggles with. It has some consistency problems as it doesn't necessarily have a great draw engine. Pretty much your only draw engine is the Teal Mask Ogre Pond. So I think this deck has some, I would say, potential. It's definitely not a bad deck, but it does take some relatively rough matchups. Your matchup against Cerulege is, in my opinion, pretty difficult. Yes, you do have access to things like the Regigigas. However, oftentimes that is not enough. You also have some relatively rough matchups against some of the other top decks. I think it has some potential, but it's just inherent inconsistency, I think, is going to hold itself back. Next up, we have Alakazam. Alakazam is in my opinion, probably bottom of tier 2 deck. If there was a tier 2.5, it would probably go there. It's just, it has a very high power level and can definitely run over some of these more linear decks in the format. However, its Gardevoir matchup and its Dragapult matchup and its Grimmsnarl matchup all aren't really very good. So honestly, I'm going to put it in tier 3. It does great against, kind of the beat stick decks in the format. However, if you're playing against, some of the, I would say, arguably top 5 decks in the format, you definitely can struggle as they can throw, lots of one prizers at you. They might have access to things, like the TM Devo as well, and also lots of damage spreading. So I think this deck has potential, but it really can struggle to some of the top decks in the room. Next up here, let's go over Zoroark. Zoroark most recently won the Pittsburgh Regional Championships. However, this format is a little bit different. I currently have Zoroark as a tier 2 deck at the moment. Yes, you are good against the Gardevoir variants. Yes, you are relatively good against Dragapult as well. However, your Cerulege matchup is definitely pretty rough. You're pretty decent into Golden Go, but I would say that, taking a pretty rough Cerulege matchup is not ideal. And you're kind of similar to Golden Go as well, where like you do really good against some of the top decks in the room, but when you play against some of those other decks, you can definitely struggle. For example, if you're playing against things like the Mega Venusaur, the Alakazam, can actually be somewhat tough as well. Raging Bolt is a really difficult matchup. So there definitely are some, pretty rough matchups that this deck has, but you are good against Gardevoir and also Dragapult, which is a big thing that you have going for it. Actually, also wanted to mention the Grimmsnarl matchup is actually not very good as well. They can set out the double Frostlass and then, push for the TM Devo plays, which can sometimes overwhelm you. So you got to be careful about that. Next up here, we have, let's go over, let's do Mega Manectric. Yeah, let's do that one. I was trying to find some of the new decks here. Let's do Mega Manectric. I think Mega Manectric is a fun tier deck. Unfortunately, having access to Mega Manectric is nice, but it is a 3-prize Pokemon, unfortunately, which can kind of, screw over some prize trades in some situations. It's just fine. It's just like another Miraidon deck, where you're trying to amp, or I would say just like relatively early and then go into the Mega Manectric. The problem is with that is you can't really amp you very much very consistently early game, as you don't have important cards like the Luminion, Force Seal Stone, double turbo energy as well to actually be able to consistently amp you very much. So that is one of the issues that this card has, in my opinion, or just like deck in general. Just like amp is a lot slower now, which I think means this deck just kind of feels like a worse Joltik box or a worse Joltik Golden Go. Next up here, actually, speaking of Joltik Golden Go, I think this deck is still solid. I think it is a tier 2 deck. Your Gardevoir matchups are relatively sketchy, but Amp is still very powerful. You take very good matchups into like the Zoroark. Your Grimmsnarl matchup is also great, and your Dragapult matchup is pretty good too. So I definitely respect this deck. I think this deck is going to show up, and I would not be surprised to see some success. Next up here, we have some of the Dragapult variants. I think that Dragapult Dusknoir is a top of tier 2 deck. It's just the Gardevoir matchups just aren't very good. Your Zoroark matchup isn't great. Your Golden Go matchup is kind of sketchy as well. So those are kind of the things that are holding it back at the moment. This would kind of be another deck that if there was a tier 1.5, it would probably go into that. But I think that this deck currently is at the top of tier 2. So yeah. Next up here, have... Let's see. Let's go over just some of the other decks. Hydrapple, I think, is a tier 3 deck, pretty much on the similar level to Venusaur. Pure Joltik box is like bottom of tier 2. I think it's just worse Joltik Golden Go. Typhlosion we'll put into tier 3. I think it is kind of above those. Terrabox is another one I actually wanted to talk about. Terrabox is definitely a very solid deck. I think it is a top of tier 2 deck currently in the standard format. I think that this deck is still relatively good. It does gain the Kangaskhan, which is nice. So honestly, I'm going to put it actually at the bottom of tier 1. I still think the deck is good. It is pretty good into decks, like the Golden Go, the Gardevoir matchups are fine. I think this deck is actually fine. I'll put it at the bottom of tier 1. I think this deck is actually pretty good. Next up, we got Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt is a tier 2 deck currently. Have it kind of more towards the bottom. The biggest problem with this deck is the Gardevoir matchup is just abysmal. Your Cerulege matchup is actually not very good as well because they have access to Legacy Energy, but you do take pretty good matchups against the Golden Go archetypes and also Zoroark as well. So you do have some relatively decent matchups going there for you. Next up, let's go over Archaludon. It's kind of another fun tier deck. Blissey, tier 3. Conk is kind of cool, actually. However, if there's this much Gardevoir expected, then I think Conk is probably more of a tier 3 or bottom of tier 2 deck at the moment. It does do exceptionally well against some of these more linear decks. However, your Gardevoir matchup is just really, really rough, which is why I currently have it in tier 3. Crustle, I think, is a tier 2 deck at the moment. I think the deck is actually not as bad as some people might think. You pretty much just lose to Gardevoir, but you do now have access to the Psyduck, which does help out quite a bit against Dragapult Dusknoir, makes that matchup a lot better, and you do have pretty good matchups against things, like the Golden Go. The Zoroark is, a pretty decent matchup as well. Cerulege is pretty much an auto win. Your Terrabox matchup is fine. However, you're pretty much on Operation Dodge Gardevoir, because if you hit it, you're probably not going to have a good time. Next up here, we got Charizard Pidgeot. I think Charizard Pidgeot is definitely a solid deck at the moment. I currently have it at the top of tier 2. A lot of these decks are actually just very, very close to each other. So I think that, these deserve their spot in tier 2. I think, Charizard Pidgeot is quite good. It has a decent matchup into Gardevoir. Not amazing, but a decent matchup. The only issue with this deck is the Dragapult Dusknoir matchup. Now, you do have access to Psyduck, which does make this matchup a lot more manageable. However, things just like Itchy Pollen at the beginning of the game could just pretty much brick you out. So that's, I think, kind of the biggest issue, more than the Dusknoir, actually, in some spots. Next up here, we got Purepult. I think Purepult is just another tier 2 deck in the format. I personally am a big fan of the Dragapult Dusknoir. I think that this deck is significantly better right now than Purepult, but Purepult, some people think, is a little bit more consistent. You have a little bit more space to add other things into the deck. Wugtrio, I will put that into fun. Mewtwo into fun. Mega Lucario, I think, is a decent deck. It's pretty much just loses to Gardevoir. However, I think it is a reasonable deck. You definitely have a chance against a lot of things. Actually, you can play Hariyama plus Reversal Energy Max Spout, which is really powerful. Really helps out into things, like the Golden Go matchup. It can be a little bit inconsistent at times, but you do have the Lunatone and Solrock. So I think this deck is decent. Honestly, I'll put it at top of tier 3 at the moment, but I definitely would not be surprised to see this deck see some success moving forward. Next up, we got Grimmsnarl. I think Grimmsnarl is a tier 1 deck. I'm going to put it actually right here, right behind a Gardevoir at the moment. This deck is great. It has a pretty solid Gardevoir matchup. Its Dragapult matchup is also good. Its Golden Go matchup is a lot better than it used to be because a lot of these Golden Go Solrock lists are cutting that Monkey Dory, which means that, yes, they do have access to Picnic Basket, but Picnic Basket oftentimes is not as effective as a consistent Monkey Dory each turn. So I think this deck is great, and I would not be surprised to see this deck see a lot of success moving forward. You also have a pretty decent Terrabox matchup as well, and your Cerulege matchup is pretty decent too. This deck is great, and I think is definitely peaking at the right time, gaining access to things like the Yveltal, and also the Lily's Determination is a big boost for the deck. Next up, we have Garchomp. I think Garchomp is a tier 2 deck in the format. It actually has some relatively decent matchups. It's pretty close into a lot of these decks, actually. It's just kind of inconsistent at the beginning of the game and is incredibly reliant on finding that turn 1 Technical Machine evolution. If it's able to do that and get fully going, it actually has a lot of potential. Cards like the Premium Power Pro and the Lily's Determination really give it a big boost that it needed to be able to reach those situations where you could actually consistently attack with the deck. So being able to get to that point where you can actually threaten big one-hit KOs on some of these high HP things is actually quite nice. So I think this deck is good. I'm going to currently put it right here in tier 2. Next up, we have the Kangaskhan decks. I wanted to go over these because they have been seeing some talk. We have the Kangaskhan Fortress deck that aims to use the Acerola over and over again to make the Kangaskhan pretty much invincible. I think this deck is decent. I just think it's a little bit gimmicky at times, but I would not be surprised to see this variant of Kangaskhan see some success. I think I'm going to put them both into tier 3. I haven't done a crazy amount of testing with this deck, but I think it has some potential. I've seen this deck be played, and if they get fully going, it can actually be pretty threatening due to that potential Acerola loop, as they are able just to spam that card over and over and over again after using potentially multiple fortresses. And then also, this is going to be the Buffalo variant. I think this deck is actually pretty solid overall. I currently have it actually in tier 2. This is just, kind of the tanky variant. I like this one. It's a little less, I feel like, gimmicky than Fortress, and I think this one might see some success. Next up here, we have a Dragapult Charizard. I just think this is worse Charizard and worse Dragapult Dusknoir. I don't think there's an amazing reason to play this deck at the moment. I think it's like fine, but I don't necessarily think it's a great deck. Next up, we have EVBox. EVBox has been seeing some success. I believe Emma won the Full Grip tournament recently, which was technically the first major U.S. tournament. It had, I believe, over 100 players, or I guess around 100 players. And it was actually won by the Flareon box deck. I think Flareon's, a pretty decent deck. You do okay into Gardevoir. Your Grimmsnarl matchup is decent because you have access to Leafeon. I think the deck is fine. I think it's just a solid tier 2 deck. Its Gardevoir matchup is very scary, though, and that's the big thing that concerns me about this archetype is, can you actually get through a top-tier Gardevoir player? Ho Armrouge, just a tier 3 deck. It's like okay. I actually would put it below probably all of these except for Hydrapple and the rest of these at the moment. So yeah, we'll probably put it right there. Greninja Pidgeot has been seeing a little bit of success in online tournaments. I think this deck is okay. Greninja is a pretty powerful attacker overall, but I think it just doesn't have an amazing power level. It's like fine. I just don't necessarily view it as a top tier deck, let's just say. And honestly, a lot of these decks in tier 3 aren't really considered bad decks in the format. They just have, I would say multiple weaknesses or problems against some of the top decks that really hurt its viability. Next up, we got just regular Golden-Go. I'm actually a big fan of regular Golden-Go. I'm just going to say this is the Togekiss variant of the deck. I think Togekiss is actually a little bit better right now, I think at the top of tier 2, just because you have a little bit of a better chance against a lot of these other decks down here that you might oftentimes struggle with, as you are able to take potentially multiple prizes on a one prizer. So that is quite nice. Next up, we have Frostlass Budew. I think this is just worse Grimmsnarl at the moment, so we're going to put it in tier 3. And this is where we are currently. Honestly, I'm going to put Gardevoir Jelly as a tier S deck. I think it deserves to be here after its most recent tournament performances. And just, Gardevoir in general is just the strongest deck in the format. You could also put this up here as well. So this is currently where I'm at the moment. I usually don't like to put decks into tier S. It's just Gardevoir keeps dominating every tournament. It's kind of hard not to recognize it as the far and away strongest deck. So this is where I'm at currently. Let me know if you agree or disagree, if there's a deck that I missed. But from my testing, this is where I have landed at the moment. But anyways, with that being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thanks so much for all the support. As always, this is Smart TCG. I'll speak with you guys again soon. Peace out.